You are listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Sol, and in this episode we are going to talk about lists. Movie lists. There's thousands upon thousands of movie lists out there, from award winners to personal recommendations to suggestions and recommendations compiled by institutes. But what makes a list of movies worthwhile or interesting to work on? All six of us who have joined the podcast for this episode are members of a website called icmforum.com. It is a site that allows you to, at a glance, track your progress on 236 official lists. These range from the They Shoot Pictures Top 1000 to every film ever nominated for the Best Picture Oscar, to 1001 movies you must see before you die, to a list of the best Greek films of all time as compiled by 6 movie critics 13 years ago. If you are not a member of iCheck Movies, don't worry, you'll still be able to follow along with our discussion. We'll talk more broadly about lists in general, but when we get into debating official list issues, we'll be referring to the 236 lists selected by a handful of moderators for the iCheck Movies progress page. To begin exploring this topic, I'll ask my 5 wonderful co-hosts, Chris, Tom, Wayne, Adam, and Lauren, to explain what they think makes a good list. Is it a list that has been recently updated? A list that has unique titles? A list that has only great titles on it? A list that has a credible source, or something else altogether? And to kick off the conversation, we'll start with the one person who cares the least about lists here, so much so that he didn't want to host, as he regularly does. Chris, what do you think makes a good list?
Well, that's an introduction. I think for me, the most interesting thing about a list will be how likely I am to like the films on it, like my affinity with whoever the list creator or list creators are. So it doesn't have to be that I care deeply about the status of the individual. It could be your list, Saul. Or especially if hi Chris, here's 10 films I really think you like. I will take that far, far more seriously than a random critic from Sight and Sound Players to Cinema. But in terms of official list and what I'm looking for, it will be 2 things. One of them is to just catch up on anything huge I might have missed. So a film that's on They Should Pictures, Don't They? I will go out of my way to see, even if I'm not overly interested in it, just so I have seen that big film and I can discuss it with other people. I don't want to be caught culturally unaware, if you will. And also just out of interest to see what other people care about, what other people like, and just expand my views. Sometimes it's just, like, for instance, I'm not a big fan of musicals, but I will want to, see the biggest one to see if there's any of them that could change my mind. And sometimes I will like said musical, for instance. So it's one about seeing films that I think I like, one about seeing films that lots of other people like, I feel like I really should see, and another one just about learning and seeing and broadening my horizon and getting out of my comfort zone a little bit.
Very interesting response there, Chris, and glad to know that you trust me more than a random film critic. What about you, Tom? What do you think makes a good list?
I think I share quite a similar view to Chris here. The source of the list doesn't really matter. It's how likely the list is to provide me with new favourites, new films that I'm going to love. Essentially, I like the big lists where there's like hundreds upon hundreds of films, like They Shoot Pictures, Don't They? Things where you're filling in gaps of classics that you might not have seen. But I also love those obscure lists that own in on smaller areas of cinema and films that are really good that might not necessarily be well known in the film community. So yeah, similar to Chris, it's a bit of everything for me.
Interesting response there, Tom. I am also a big fan of big lists, but I'll get more into my response later. And it's interesting to know that you likewise don't really care about the source, because people who are listening to us who are not on iCheck Movies won't know, but the list mods on iCheck Movies are very big on getting good and reliable sources. So to move over, what about you, Wayne? What do you think makes a good list?
For a good list, I'll always go back to the reliable sources. Using the IMDb top 250, for example, was the first list I actively worked on once I started becoming a cinephile. So I hold lists like that and 1001 movies, high them in high esteem. But what also makes a good list is a decent topic.
Thanks, Wayne. What about you, Adam? What do you think makes a good list?
I mean, I guess I agree with Chris and Tom to an extent, but I think the source, if we're talking about official lists, I don't know if we're getting into this yet, but if we're talking about an official list, then I do care about the source, because I think the lists are a bit more interesting if you know that there's some kind of quality source behind it. If you're following a list of 1,000 films, I would rather kind of reliable critics behind it or reliable sources behind it, rather than it just being a random person giving me 1,000 films. But if it was just a shorter list from a friend, then that would also be good for me. So I think the source matters depending on the size of the list and what you're using the list for. And in general, obviously, like Tom and Chris said, I want a list to be films that I might like. So I'm more likely to work through a Japanese list than like an Australian list, for example.
Ooh, shots fired against Saul. And Wayne.
And Lauren.
Oh yeah, and Lauren.
No, that's fine. Look, Australian cinema has got its ups and downs, so I don't really find offence with that. When you did say that you wouldn't trust a list of 1,000 films from a random person, I thought, well, I'm a random person, but then you talked about friends afterwards, so I guess if it came from me, it might be a bit more interesting.
Again, it depends on if we're talking about official lists. I mean, if you gave me a list of your favorites and it was a longer list, I would find it more interesting, but I wouldn't want it to be an official list on ICM. But also, I'm probably more likely to work through a shorter list from a friend. So if you give me your top 10, I might watch them all. If you give me your top 1,000, I'd probably more likely to work through a top 1,000 from critics than just one person. But a shorter list from a friend would be really interesting as well.
I'll just correct my answer slightly. Then I think I wasn't talking about ICM because I don't really follow official lists on I check movies. But yes, I think I do agree with Adam that when we're talking about films that should be official, like me or Saul, there's no real reason why our recommendations should be official unless you count us as great critics because of this podcast. Once we actually have something that's meant to be curated for everyone, people who don't know Saul, don't know myself, that's not going to be that interesting. I think that you'll want those lists that are curated there to be either from experts, credited experts essentially, or from sources that any random user will be more likely to care about.
What about you, Lauren? What would you say makes a good list?
For me, it depends on whether we're talking about what makes a good official list and what makes a list that I want to work on. Like Adam was saying, and I think Wayne as well, like the source of the list is important when it comes to if it's official on I Check Movies. But for ones that I want to watch, then I would just be looking through the list and seeing are these movies things that I like to watch or movies I already like. But I don't have like any particular people or sources who I like 100% trust. So I'm just kind of like looking around everywhere and kind of looking for things that interest me, like the films specifically.
Thanks, Lauren. In terms of what I look for in a good list of movies, I don't think anybody else has said this, but for me, what makes a really interesting list to me is unique titles. So if I'm searching for films to watch for a challenge, something particular that I'm looking for, I can go through a bunch of letterbox lists and they'll usually have the same few titles on there. So for me, a really interesting list, especially if it's on Letterboxd, is if it's got unique titles in there, films that I haven't heard of before, films that aren't on another list for that topic. It might be something like time travel, and you know, like the same 10 to 12 films. If I can find a list that's got 10 to 12 on that I haven't heard of, that to me makes it a really good list. And it even applies to iCheck Movies, but in a different way. If there's an official list on iCheck Movies and it's got a bunch of films that are only on that one list, that will actually make that list more intriguing to me than another list, because I Check Movies for me is all about discovery, and if you're getting lists adopted by the list mods that have the same films on them time and time again, there isn't really that sense of discovery there. It's more just reinforcing what we already know of films that we should be looking for. So for me, it's unique titles, but I do understand where everybody else is coming from, and I think we all have a really passionate response for what we like in lists, even if Chris says that he doesn't care that much.
I'm sorry about that, Sal.
No, that's fine, Chris. It's okay. It's good to have a naysayer on here. It makes it more interesting.
For the record, I mean, I do care about lists to some extent. It's just that I don't care about the idea of officialness. Like, I follow lists on ICM that are not official. Some of the lists I work on the most on ICM using their software, essentially, are unofficial lists. So we can get into that a bit later, I guess.
Yeah, we'll get into that a bit later, because as other people will know who have listened to other podcasts, and when I've talked about I Check Movies, I am very proud of the fact that I've got no platinum awards. So I'm not big on list completion. I'm more about cherry picking the best out of each list rather than trying to complete one. But we might get onto that a little bit later. Moving on to my next question. This sort of came up already because some of us talked about it, but I thought I'll just put the question out there. Do you prefer longer lists or shorter lists? And once again, we'll start with Chris.
I'll be the boring answer, both. I think that shorter lists are great for just like, I can complete this list. Like, this is very trimmed down. This is something I should really, really focus on. And it's just so easy to just go through them. I mean, if it's 10 films and I've seen 5, it's easy to catch up, especially if it's a source I trust. And long lists are great for what you mentioned, cherry picking. So there's a list of 1,000 films. I check movies, like which films have I not seen yet. Then I can just quickly see, okay, which are from countries I'm especially interested in, or genres I'm especially interested in, decades I'm especially interested in, those films I haven't seen, maybe there's something I haven't heard of. I click on those and check them out, and then I just prioritize the ones that I'm especially interested in. So both types of lists have advantages.
That's a very nice and neutral answer, Chris, from the one person who might be a little less passionate about the rest of us about official lists. Moving on to Tom. Do you prefer longer lists or shorter lists?
To be honest, I'm not sure I have a preference, because it all, for me, just depends on the quality of the list. I like working on short lists or long lists, providing all the films are likely to work for me. If a list is really good and I'm getting lots of favourites out of it, then I'd much prefer it to be... I'm not as obsessed with completing the lists, getting a platinum award. Obviously, it is nice to get awards on the official list, but for me, film discovery is the priority here, and I just want to be watching good films. So if there's a list that helps me with that, then it doesn't really matter how short or long it is.
Yes, Tom, that is the best answer. List completion is totally overrated. Yeah, I sympathise with that. For me, it's about finding the best on there, not trying to see every single thing to get a magic platinum award. Moving on to Wayne, do you prefer longer lists or shorter lists?
For me, it just depends on what sort of list it is. So something like a greatest movies of all time list, the 1,000 movies that we see in like They Shoot Pictures and that 1,001 movies to see before you die, that's great. You know, it gives me 1,000 movies to choose from. But something for like a certain country or something like that, 100 best movies is a perfect place to start, and that's all I need. If I enjoy their cinema, then I can go further. Same with genres, like a horror one, I could have a bigger list, but musicals, I'd prefer a shorter. So it just depends on what the topic of the list is to what size I like.
Good answer, Wayne. With country lists, I would agree. Maybe having a bit of a shorter one rather than a bigger one would be a fair point. What about you, Adam?
I guess I would say a long list if it's a general list of the best films ever, like They Shoot Pictures or 1,001 Movies Before You Die. And then generally a shorter list if it's a country or awards or something like that. But it still depends. Like, if it's a country where I've watched absolutely tons of the films, I want a long list. If it's something I'm really interested in, I want a long list. if it's an area of cinema maybe I haven't explored very much, then I think a shorter list makes more sense just to give me a taste of the films. So I think it depends on my level of interest and type of list to some extent.
Yeah, very fair point about the countries, because all of us have seen more films from some countries than others. What about you, Lauren?
More or less agree with what everyone else has said, really, is that it just depends on the list. If it's something that I don't know, a topic or country or whatever that I don't know much about, I'd prefer it to be shorter because I want all the sort of filler cut out and just get that, the cream of the crop. But if it's something that I want to deep dive into, then I want a long list. And also for They Shoot Pictures and 1001 Movies, I like those general lists to be big. But I also, like other people have said, country lists, I want them small. And it depends as well on how much there is of that specific topic. If there's only 100 films from a particular country ever made, we don't need a top 250 from that country. Doesn't make sense. So I think it just depends on the topic.
Yeah, fair call there, Lauren, because thinking about one of my favourite filmmaking countries, which is Moldova, yeah, that would probably have less than 100 films. So if we had a top 100 from Moldova, it'll just be every single film ever made. In terms of myself, I'm going to be the one person who's going to be going against the grain here, because for me, I would always prefer a longer list. I guess for me, it's a question of availability and being able to track the films down. If I'm given a list of, say, 20 films, even if I haven't seen any of them, the chances of me being able to find all of them on my streaming services, unless it's like the box office list or something, if I was given a very small list, the chance of me being able to find all of those would be minimal. Whereas if I've got a list of, say, 1,000, even if it's from somewhere, let's say I'm doing a medium-sized country, so 1,000 films from Romania or from Poland or something like that, even though that would seem like a lot, for me it gives me a lot more options. So I prefer longer lists just because there's more to discover out there, there's more to choose from. The only downside of longer lists for me is that they're harder to complete, but like I've said before, I'm not big into completion, so for me it's always longer lists, but very interesting to find out that I'm not in the majority on that.
Well, as people started talking about country lists, I think I'm changing my view a little bit more towards yours, so because I was thinking about the lists that are official, and I see them Chile's 50 best Chilean movies of all time, and in those cases when it's just 50 or 53 films like the Hungarian list, it's a little bit annoying. I tend to work on other lists from those countries just because 50 is not a lot, especially from a country like Chile or a country like Hungary, where I'll be trying to see quite a few films. It's just why are there so few films on those lists? Those countries have massive outputs. So in those cases, definitely would at least 100. I mean, I don't need 1,000 films from Chile, but I wouldn't have hated a list like that. And for countries like France, absolutely, bring it on.
I have to agree there. When I said the countries before, it's more the countries that I'm starting out. List France, Japan, Korea, anything like that. 100's not even enough. You'd need at least a few hundred movies just to satisfy the output. But yeah, so I will correct my point from earlier.
It's worth noting too that, in terms of iCheck movies, it's not just for people who go out of their way to watch hundreds and thousands of films a year. It's worth keeping in mind that for a lot of people, seeing a huge list is scary because they want to have something easy that they can actually work on. So when you get 50 films from Chile or 100 films from France, and you've seen 5 or you've seen 10 films from France before, that's a little bit more digestible. They can get started. But I think for us in particular, it's always about exploring more. So I think it's also worth thinking about that for a website like that.
Very good point with the countries, because I know when the Israeli list was adopted in iCheck Movies, there was a lot of complaints about the fact that it was only 40 films long, and then the list mods go, we can only work with what's out there, and the list of Portuguese films that they wanted to adopt was actually only 12 films long because the people who made the list didn't want the runners-up in there. So I guess it's a hard juggling act when you're trying to find lists to be official on iCheck Movies. And we will come to the official list shortly, but I've got 2 more questions to ask first, which are more broader for the people who still have no idea what iCheck Movies is. So one of those questions is, do you prefer dynamic or static lists? So that means, do you prefer lists that get updated maybe on a weekly or monthly basis, or do you prefer static lists that don't change at all? And once again, we will start with Chris.
To be honest with you, I mean, I don't really mind. Like some of the lists I work on, they were made 20 years ago and they haven't been updated since. So I don't mind that. But I do think that thinking about countries, for instance, in some cases, like I think the Hungarian list, for instance, is 12 years old now. I do like that, lists that are about a period of time, like from a country or a genre or just all time, and they're static and they're missing the last 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, then they're no longer representative and they're not great as official lists. If they're not official lists, it's great, and I'll still definitely work on them. But, the more outdated they are, the less representative and the less qualitative they are. But I absolutely love going through a list like Godard or Truffaut. They made interesting lists and that haven't been updated in decades. So in many cases, you have directors, critics, etc., who are dead, who made interesting lists. So I don't mind if they're not updated, but I think that if you're trying to actually cover something and be representative, it's a big problem if they're not dynamic.
Yeah, that's a very fair point, Chris. And I did sort of jokingly or not jokingly mention the Greek list on iCheck Movies in my introduction. So we'll see what other people come up with. What about you, Tom? Do you prefer dynamic or static lists?
I much prefer dynamic lists. The lists that I focus on the most on iCheck Movies are the dynamic ones. So the most favourite list is one that is very close to my heart. I've been working on for a number of years, and I log on every Monday and Thursday to see if there's been any new additions to the list. And it's great when a new film pops up because it doesn't happen that often. But it could be something great that has flown under the radar, or a new film that has only recently come out that is worth checking out. More recently, the decade lists for ICM have become official, and that's great because they also fluctuate, and on a Monday and a Thursday, I get to see if there's been any new additions. But it's not just the weekly updating lists that I enjoy, which are dynamic, but also the ones which are community-based, which involve our input, such as the 500 less than 400 or doubling the canon. And it's great to see new films coming into them every year. And it's also really fun because we get to play a part in what those new films can be. So it's definitely dynamic lists for me.
Yeah, great response there, Tom. I was going to mention the decade lists myself, so I'm glad that you did. What about you, Wayne?
I have to just echo everyone else. It's definitely dynamic lists. Most of the lists are the best of something, and you can't have a best of when new movies are always coming out, so they need to be updated. The decade ones are a slight different thing because, they don't change as much the older decades, but when, as I said, talking about best of, things like that, it has to be dynamic.
Yeah, you've got no disagreements from me about that, but we'll see about the remaining couple of co-hosts. What about you, Adam?
Yeah, definitely dynamic as well. As you probably know, I've been working on the 2020s list, for example, on ICM, and it's just a lot more interesting when the list is constantly updating. I also think some of the best of lists get outdated quite quickly. So if there hasn't been an update for a few years, so even something like 1001 Movies Before I Die hasn't been updated for a while. And I think some of those best of lists lose a bit of appeal if they don't have any films from the last few years. And I think it's just more interesting working on a list where there's going to be updates, there's going to be new films to get you interested in.
Yeah, that's a great response, Adam. And I know for you it's been a bit of a challenge trying to get as many checks as you can on the 2020s list, the decade list on iCheck Movies. And I think, that is definitely part of the fun about it. What about you, Lauren?
I like dynamic lists the most. I think it's more interesting when they get updated and little new things slip through, like the decade lists. And also, Tom's mention of like community lists. Like I host the highest rated list on the forum, and I love seeing that change every time I do an update. and yeah, little hidden gems slip through, and then other things suddenly just fall out because more people have seen them. I think that sometimes static lists can be interesting when they're really a time capsule. When I'm looking for lists for They Shoot Zombies, sometimes you get lists that are, say, like the best horror films of 2009, and it's done at the end of 2009. And sometimes certain bigger films haven't come out yet, and so this list kind of acts as this time capsule for some smaller films that would probably get knocked off the list after some of the bigger ones come out. And sometimes like older lists from like books from like the 50s, and they're set, the contemporary opinion of the time. So sometimes they can be interesting, but overall I prefer dynamic lists.
That's a very good point, Lauren, about time capsule lists. And I guess we've got lists like the Stanley Kubrick list and the Francois Truffaut list on iCheck Movies, and those ones can't be dynamic because the directors aren't still alive to be able to add more films to it. But in general, I massively prefer dynamic lists. I know in iCheck Movies, from some people who are a bit obsessed with climbing up on the rankings, there are some people who just hate dynamic lists. They want everything to be static because they want to get a platinum. They want to be able to complete every single list. But for me, as somebody who's never been after the platinums, I love the dynamic part of it. I love the fact that a lot of movies that are popping up in cinemas are going on the 2020s list, and I check movies. And yeah, for me, the dynamic part is what makes lists so interesting. I love doubling the canon. I love the 500 under 400 hidden gems list on I check movies, and they're just great for me because I sort of know that there's always going to be new films on them. Things are always going to be replaced, and any updates actually going to be a pretty massive overhaul. And for me, that's exciting. It's exciting to have a list that's going to be able to change that much by over 100 films in between updates, as opposed to something like the spaghetti westerns list on iCheck Movies, which when it gets updated, only one film, if any, changes every time it gets updated. Moving on to my last question before we get straight into iCheck Movies. My last general question is, does it matter if there are lost films on a list? Because this is something which gets debated a lot on the ICM forum. So just wondering, what did you guys think about that? Does it matter if a list has got a lost film or more than one lost film on it? And we'll start with you again, Chris.
Well, as I'm not a completist, it doesn't matter to me at all. It's just a sad reminder of something great that has been lost in time. And sometimes they're uncovered again too. And if you have that shout out from before, it gets really exciting. The one exception is if you have something lost that's found, you get that excitement and you realize that, this really isn't very good, like that Sherlock Holmes movie from 1920 that was rediscovered. It was just so bloody bland and had been on some lists from back then when it was first released. But no, I have no issue with lost films being on these time capsule lists.
Yeah, great point, Chris. And yeah, they do feel like time capsule lists when there are lost films on there. What about you, Tom?
I can certainly empathise with the completists who are working on a list and will never be able to complete it because a film is no longer available. But to be honest, it doesn't faze me if a film has been seen by people when it was first released and then time has passed and it's been lost, destroyed or whatever happened to quite a lot of the early films, then it should still belong on a list if enough people enjoyed it or if it was a film of note. It's obviously a shame that we'll never get to see it, but if it was worthy of being on the list, then it shouldn't be removed just because it's lost. It should be there as a reminder of the film.
Yeah, good point, Tom. It's sort of like the only way we can remember a film if it's lost is by honouring it by keeping its position on a list. What do you think about lost films, Wayne?
I agree with the comments so far. The lists they're on are capsules in time and they should belong there. But because they're on lists that I'm not actively looking at, I really don't have an opinion at the moment. It'll come down the track when I finally move on to them and we'll see how much it annoys me.
Yeah, fair point, Wayne. And I guess I've got no lists where I'm close to completing either. Oh, actually, no, I do. I've got one where I'm about three checks away from platinum. But yeah, for me, it's not an issue because it's not getting in the way of me completing anything. So I understand where you're coming from.
I was just going to say that, as some of the others mentioned earlier, sympathizing with the completist, I think that for those who don't know, ICM, like it's a bit like a game too, like it's gamification, and you get trophies if you complete the list. And if I can understand if there's a list of 100 titles, you watch 99 of them, and there's one lost film on it, you cannot get a trophy, and that list is kind of broken then. So if the system was ever updated so that these lost films were not counted towards the trophy, that would probably be a good compromise specifically for site users who care about that.
Yeah, that's a fair point, Chris, and that has been floated to the list mods before, but I don't think they've ever come to a decision about that. I guess the hard thing is that lost films aren't always lost. Sometimes they're just thought to be lost or incorrectly cited as being lost because there's no 35mm print or whatever of it, but it still exists on video and it's still been uploaded online from a VHS transfer, so it's actually technically not lost. So bit of a tricky one, excluding films in order to get trophies, but we'll see if Adam's got anything he wants to say.
Well, I don't really mind there being lost films on a sort of best of list, but I think one example of when it was frustrating was when ICM adopted the ICM list, the decade lists. And for example, we had pre-1910s lists, and sometimes people were mistakenly voting for the wrong film. So you had random sort of films appearing that no one had actually seen, and people were voting for the wrong one or checking films they hadn't seen. So I think there's certain times when removing them from the list or blocking them from checks would make a difference, particularly dynamic lists that deal with much older films where there's a lot of mistaken identity and it's a bit harder to find the films.
Yeah, that's a very fair point, Adam. I know when they adopted the pre-1910s, and I think even the 1910 lists, I think there were a few issues with that, with users that had mischecked the wrong film. What about you, Lauren?
Yeah, I agree with Tom's point about like if a film deserves to be on a list, then it doesn't matter if it's lost or not. But I do wish there was something on iCheck Movies to mark a film as lost, just to save mistaken checks, and just so that you know, because sometimes I go through a list of short films that I haven't checked yet, and then I'm clicking on them, and then 100 of them will be lost. So I could have just saved time if there was a way to show these ones were lost, so don't bother wasting my time trying to find them. But in general, if they're on a list, I don't have a problem. It's just iCheck Movies.
I just wanted to say one thing, which was like, it also frustrates me that the argument is normally, well, there could be like a 110-year-old who might have seen this film at some point. That seems to be the argument against blocking lost films, but I think it's a bit weak.
As somebody who owns a technically lost film, I don't know if I would call that weak. I do own a VHS of Where is Parsifal, which is this not very great comedy with Orson Welles in a supporting role from the early 80s. And BFI had marked it lost on their website, and actually contacted them, and I said, "You're welcome to my VHS copy," and they said, "No, we don't want it. We actually want an actual film stock of it." And they refused to change the information on their website, so I actually went to IMDb and I changed the trivia entry on IMDb, which said that the film was lost. So coming from that perspective, I'm not open to completely ruling off lost films. But I guess that's my sort of answer to that. Lost films on a list doesn't affect me at all. And for me, I think if you take lost films off a list, I think you're sort of cheating history. We can't pretend that The Patriot was not nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars in 1928. So that happened. Yes, the film is lost. Yes, nobody can check it as far as we know. However, I think it just seems unfair to alter history and take it off the list just because we want them to all be films that we're able to see. So for me, I don't like cheating history. We'll move on then to some questions which are directly related to iCheck Movies. So I've got two questions. One of them is for the best and one of them is for the worst two lists on the site. And I really want to do the worst first, but I think we should start off on a more positive note. So on a more positive note, I'm going to limit you to two lists just due to time. So please don't give me every single decade list. I'm talking to you, Adam, possibly. Please don't give me every single list. Which would you say are the two best official lists at the moment on iCheck Movies?
I don't have an exact favorite. I have the ones that are best, which are probably like They Shoot Pictures and Sight and Sound, etc. But I would say that the ones that are probably available because of I check movies and I follow because of that would probably be the Cahiers top 10 of the year list, which is like this hunky almost mismatch of contrarianism and niche picks and time capsules just of what people liked 50 years ago, 40 years ago, and so on. And that's really fascinating because of that, even though I'll never try to watch every single film on it. And for a second pick, I don't really know. I think the Czechoslovakian list is the one I've been working on the most actively, just because I love Czech and Slovak films, and that's been just one of those films that I keep finding pearls on, and so many of them are missing subtitles, and I always check in every year or two to see, okay, which ones have been released with subtitles now. So that's the golden foundation of Czech and Slovak cinema. That's a really interesting list to me as well.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I like the checklist also. There's a lot of cool films on there. And I'm not surprised you like the Cahiers de Cinema list because it's full of art house titles. And when I watch them, I sort of slap my forehead afterwards. So it sounds very much like a you sort of list. What about you, Tom?
So I love uncovering obscure gems, films that not many people have heard of, that really are ripe for rediscovery. There's some amazing films out there from obscure film producing countries, and the best list for this is doubling the canon. There's over 1,000 films that cannot be on any of the They Shoot Pictures, Don't They top 2,500 lists or the 21st century's most acclaimed films. So they're kind of off the beaten track. And it's led me to discover some amazing films that are kind of I Check Movies community favourites, such as things like Carriage to Vienna, Happy End, Letter Never Sent. And we obviously take them for granted. They're well known amongst our community. But when you look at sites like Letterboxd and IMDb, they don't have that many ratings or reviews. So it's nice to know that, you know, the community effort enables these films to shine.
I'll change my answer.
Oh, yeah, I'm glad I've convinced Chris there that he enjoys doubling the canon as well. And then my second most favourite list, I'm probably going to embarrass someone on the podcast here, but it's the They Shoot Zombies, Don't They list. Now, I'm a huge fan of horror films. Horror is my favourite genre, and Lauren does an amazing job of curating all these lists from multiple sources, making them into a single list, compiling them to work out the best 1,000 horror films out there. And this list is updated fairly regularly, usually every year, and it's great to see what comes and goes. And there's still a good chunk of films on there that I haven't seen. And even though there are a few bad films that are on there, with horror being my favourite genre, a bad horror film isn't necessarily the end of the world. So it's always good to see what horror films are regarded as great films amongst fans who appreciate the genre as much as I do.
Great answers there, Tom. I'm a big fan of both of those lists also. And yeah, Doubling the Canon is definitely one of the most interesting lists because, like you said, it excludes, when out to 2,500, it excludes the top 2,500 films that are on They Shoot Pictures. So yeah, very, very interesting list. What about you, Wayne?
I could very simply go with just the given answers. Like I've already mentioned the IMDb top 250, the lists like the two that we're involved in making, the Doubling the Canon and 500 is less than 400 checks. But as I said before, like I like lists that are a bit more tailored to me. So I'd have to say of the more unique lists, my favourite two sort of go hand in hand. It's the Tom Dirks 100 plus most controversial films of all time and the 366 weird films. They're not your normal everyday idea. I don't think they're complete. I can give them a lot more movies they should add to them. But it gives people that just don't like the normal a chance to find something that was controversial and has people talking more than just it being a great film.
Well, that's a very controversial and a very weird answer, Wayne. But in all seriousness, I really like 366 Weird Movies also. And I was one of those people who was pushing to expand beyond 366 when they started adding more titles, but that ended up getting voted down. And the Tim Dirks list is actually pretty great also because it does have updates, not that regularly, but it's not a completely static list either. What about you, Adam?
Well, I guess I would say we've got a lot of official lists from different sources. So my favorites are the ones that link to the community and link to the users of the website. So like 500 less is less than 400, I think is the best sort of forum list that we've had. It links directly to the number of checks. It's trying to bring attention to films that people haven't seen so much. And as well as that, I would say the ICM decade lists, which is something I'd wanted them to bring in for many years, because I feel like there's so many cinephiles on the website, so why don't we generate our own lists rather than just relying on things that have been made by other people. So I think for me, they're the most sort of unique and interesting lists because the other lists you can find anywhere else, whereas these lists are specifically sort of tied to the website and our community.
Great answer, Adam. And there's definitely a big sense of community with the doubling the canon and the 500 under 400 list.
I wanted to mention doubling the canon and everything, but we were limited to 2 lists, so I was just going to say, I mean all of the community lists, but I could only say 2. That's why I went for 500 and decade.
Yeah, that's fine, Adam. I think I tripped over myself. Yes, because you said the decade lists and 500 under 400, and yeah, 500 under 400. Great community spirit behind that, and very dynamic, ever-changing list. And yeah, the decade list also the WotC whole community of iCheck movies. What about you, Lauren?
I think my answer is going to be pretty obvious. My favorite list is the IMDb Top 50 Sports list. So my favorite list is, well, I'm biased, but the They Shoot Zombies list since I made it. I think I made it to fill a gap that wasn't being met on the site. So it's clearly going to be the one that matches my taste the most. And I agree with the other people who talked about the community lists. I really like the ideas of doubling the canon and 500 less than 400, but I usually don't gel with the other people's tastes with those lists. So my second choice is all of the iCheck Movies decade lists because I really like how much they change and how they feel fresher than the IMDb lists and they feel more personal, I guess, since it's the iCheck Movies community. I don't know, I feel like the choices on them are more interesting than the IMDb lists and yeah, they're just really nice lists.
So this is the fun thing about being the 6th person to talk on a podcast of 6 people. I think all of you have covered my favorites. Like, there were 3 that I was choosing between before my top 2, which were the iCheck Movies 2020s list, the 500 under 400, and doubling the canon. All of them for me are great, dynamic lists that aren't static and ever-changing. I mean, if I wanted to throw another list in there, I might go for Criterion Collection just because it's a dynamic list that keeps getting added to, and there's always interesting titles added on. Even if you have a whole lot of Beastie Boys of video clips in there now. But anyway, I think I just went over the 2, and I'm not going to go over the 2 limit. So for the next one, let's try and keep our answers to 2, and we'll try and keep it as positive as possible. But what would you say are the 2 worst official lists on iCheck Movies? And Chris, you can be the first to slag them.
Well, I don't really mind if there's lists on the site that I'm not interested in, so it's not something that keeps me up at night, but there are some very odd inclusions. I think one of the oddest would be Total Films 50 Amazing Films You've Probably Never Seen, which just feels a bit pointless. It has some huge titles on it, like it has Come and See, it has The Cremator, it has Akira Kurosawa's Redbeard, and then it also has some very niche picks, and it's just 50 films. And I think that if you're going to highlight obscure films, that's something Doubling the Canon does already. That's something 500 and 400 does already. It's something Sight and Sound has done already. It's something They Should Picture Something has done already. So this idea of just non-seen films, and then it's just have this completely random selection from Total Film. Again, just 50 films, completely random, some huge titles there. It's just, I don't get why that list is official. It doesn't make sense to me. The only other list, I think it's good that it's there now, but I really want something better, and that's Sharon A. Russell's Guide to African Cinema. It's a list I've been actively working on, it's because there are so few lists of African cinema, but this is from a book that was released in the 90s. And it's just that we can't get something better at this point. We can't get something that were released in the 30 years afterwards that can cover this entire continent, especially given the fact that African cinema has really flourished the last several decades. Well, I think the last film on this list, the newest film on this list, I think is from 1995. So we're talking 1996, Everyone's Child. That's the newest film. So that's almost 30 years ago. So I want something much, much, much better that can cover Africa in a much more representative and interesting way.
That's a very fair point about the African list, Chris, especially given how much African cinema has expanded with Oscar-winning films like Tsotsi over the past 25 to 30 years. A more up-to-date list would be awesome. I cannot agree with you about Total Film, though. I know it's a bit of a random, weird list, but I wish there were more hidden gems lists like that, because you've got that list, we've got a Sight and Sound hidden gems, there's an Ain't Blues list, but I wish there were more lists like that had titles on there that you don't usually see. The only bad thing about Total Film is that Come and See is now the #1 film on Letterboxd.
Yeah.
So yeah, it feels a bit weird to have that on an obscure hidden gems list, but otherwise I actually really like Total Film. What about you, Tom?
My least favourite list on the site is They Shoot Pictures, Don't They? 1,000 noir films. I'm not a big fan of film noir at all. 100 is more than enough for me. I'm never going to complete the They Shoot Pictures, Don't They? 100 essential noir films, so 1,000 is just too many. Yeah, it's just not a genre that works for me. They all blend into one. I've got no intention of ever completing that list, and it just seems too huge for the genre that it represents. 1,000 horror films is fine. I imagine there's much more horror films that have been made over the year than noirs. I haven't got any stats to back that up. That's just an assumption, but I'm going with it. And as easy as it would be for me to pick a list that focuses on documentaries or shorts because I don't enjoy them, I'm actually going to go with the IMDb miniseries top 50 list, because miniseries are not films. I know that people will come back to me and have arguments about documentaries and shorts still being films, but miniseries, they're not films. And there's 50 miniseries on there that are all incredibly long, and I could watch so many actual films in that time. I've just got no interest in waiting to watch a miniseries. So yeah, they're my two least favourite lists.
That's a very valid point about the miniseries list, Tom. I agree, miniseries aren't technically films, but then I've got the weird sort of quagmire where my #2 film of all time, I've only actually seen the miniseries version of it, Fanny Alexander, but I agree, I don't really need a miniseries list on there. And I think my only checks on there have been ones where I've sort of like needed to do it because it was nominated for Dublin in the Canon or something like that. So I'm not a big fan of that one either. I am a big fan of the word quagmire. In terms of the noir list, it does seem a bit on the long side, but I guess I'm not a super big fan of noir either, but I can sort of understand that people are. It's the most popular cinematic genre out there, if you classify it as a genre. It's got by far the highest rating of all the genres on IMDb, and it is listed as a genre there. So I understand it. I guess for me, the noir list, it is very long, but all the checks in there are pretty easy. Most of them are really short films. So if I want to do a bit of check whoring, in inverted commas, it's a pretty fun one to work on. And also, if we do ever, or if the mods ever do unadopt that list, Walter Neff on our forum will unfriend absolutely everybody.
Well, before I mention my list, I'll first stand up for the miniseries. Of course, I do class them as movies, as long as they're, within the traditional 2 to 4 episodes. up until late last year, a miniseries was my favourite movie of all time. Unfortunately, I did reassess that, and Stephen King's The Stand is now back further in my top 20. But Anne of Green Gables is still my second favourite film of all time, and it's a miniseries, so I'll stand up for that particular list, sorry. But my two are pretty much hand in hand. It's the Marshall Julius's the action movie A to Z, and Tom Vick's Asian Cinema, A Field Guide. They both just seem like random books. So there's movies in there that have no right being on a best of list or something like that. The list is not something that I want to go checking out to find the best Asian or the best action films, because random movies like how is Rush Hour an Asian film, something like that. They're my worst two lists.
Yeah, when you said the Tom Vick's list, I thought that's got a heap of really cool Asian films from around the world. But you're right, it's not a particularly well curated list, because I think for Hong Kong they've got a whole bunch of Jackie Chan films that he did overseas and not just in Hong Kong. So I can sort of understand that, but for me it wouldn't be towards the bottom. I guess also because it's a longer list and I love longer lists. Marshall Julius is an interesting case. There are some interesting films on there, but a lot of them are crap, and the way the book was written, it's actually every film on there that is given from, I think, 0.5 star to 5 stars to. So it's not even a curated best of list. It's sort of like what it considers to be the most important or the most, I don't know how you'd say it, the ones which has got the most to talk about are on there. So I can sort of understand that. And a lot of people over the years have said it's not a very good list, so I understand. But there are some cool, mainly the Asian action films, and there are some cool films on there. What about you, Adam?
I might try and cheat slightly in terms of numbers, but I'll group them together. So I think, first of all, I have a big issue with the IMDb decade lists because, IMDb removed the lists many years ago, and what we have left is just pretty rubbish. So, for example, the 2020's IMDb list, the number of films eligible for the list because of the checks required is just so low that the list is a total waste of time at the moment. And I think those lists could be a lot better. Well, I wouldn't be against just removing them entirely based on what they're currently like, especially the 2020s one, because it's just a blockbuster list practically at the moment. Another thing I would say, which I've mentioned many times as well, is there's a little group of lists that were made official at the start of I Check Movies because they were like websites that were somehow connected to ICM. So you've got this whole group of like Dutch lists and like Reddit and Falk and everything, where they're basically a top 250 that kind of with films that are on a million other lists, and I don't think they really have any value. And I guess it's always been frustrating that they have this big group of lists that are a bit worthless from communities that have nothing to do with ICM or sometimes no longer exist. Yet there's no ICM forum top 250. I find that I feel like we've got these legacy lists from websites that don't exist or don't care about ICM. And then you've got an ICM forum list where it's much more connected to the site. And I'm going to just cheat slightly by saying one other list. The Rotten Tomatoes list, I just need to bring that one up because when we recorded the Pixar episode, I noticed that The Incredibles 2 was somehow in the top 100 films of all time, according to Rotten Tomatoes, despite the fact that it only has 93% on the website. So that seems like the most ridiculously random list, which doesn't make any sense whatsoever in its current form. So I'm kind of cheating, but that's just a really weird list that I can't understand what the formula is. It might be an interesting list on Tomatoes if you had a proper top 100 or something, but how The Incredibles 2 is on a list of the best list of all time when it's nowhere near the top 100 rated films on Rotten Tomatoes, I don't know. That's another one that I just had to chuck in because I don't understand why it's on the website at all. But yeah, I would like to go on and find other lists to mention, but I think Saul will get angry at me, so...
Yeah, looking at this list now, it's really weird. Like, the newest film is from 2020, but almost all of the films, well over half the films are from the last 10, 15 years. So it's a really weird list. There's a lot of just completely random films on there. Like One Night in Miami is there, The Invisible Man, Us. It's odd that these films are there. Like Mission Impossible Fallout is there. Yeah, that's a very odd list. I haven't even looked at this list. I mean, I think Rotten Tomatoes is so huge that it makes sense that it's there, but it's just I don't get how they pick their films, especially if they don't have 100%.
Do you want me to re-record my answer and list all the lists that I like, so that you can?
No.
I didn't list 200 lists. I grouped lists together, and I feel like that counts as one list if you group 5 or 10 lists together. That's one list.
It's a list of lists.
That's in my opinion that counts. And Rotten Tomatoes wasn't really, that was a +1. That wasn't like So I think I managed to answer within the limits of the question, kind of.
It's fine, Adam, and I can understand grouping all the decade lists together. And you're right, the IMDb decade lists are rubbish, and we sort of don't need them any longer now that we've got the iCheck Movies decade list. And Rotten Tomatoes is a very fair call because that's a list that's massively out of date, and I don't know what's happening with that. And I definitely think it's kind of insulting that we're the forum that's done the most to promote iCheck Movies, and yet they're only permitting us to have one single list, especially when we've got all these defunct forums that have their top 250 on there. We're not able to have our list on there because we've already got a list in the hidden gems. But that's for the list mods to debate, but I agree that those are definitely good choices for lists that aren't particularly great.
Sorry, I was just going to say, don't come back to me when they adopt the letterboxd top whatever ahead of us. But yeah, that's another. Can we just cut this out? Because I feel like I'm going to be removed from ICM after destroying the mods. But yeah, anyway, sorry.
Okay, I don't know if that's a joke or not. I'll decide when I come to edit it. Moving on, what about you, Lauren? So the topic again is your 2 worst lists.
Yeah, okay, so there's lots of lists that I have no interest in, but I don't really consider that to be a worse list just because it doesn't interest me. So my least favorite list is the They Shoot Pictures 1000 noir films. And it's not because I'm not a fan of noir, which I don't really like noir. And I think I'd love a top 1,000 of every genre. But the thing is that the criteria behind the list is something like films that have been mentioned as being a noir film. And that's just not good enough criteria for a list. So I just really don't like that list. And my second list was kind of like 3 lists. It's the Criterion lists and that Eureka's list, because I don't even know what those are. And I don't care about companies that just put movies on DVDs. That just doesn't mean anything to me. I don't know what the criteria is. So again, they just kind of feel like a list of random films that got released on DVD. So those lists I just really don't care about at all.
Interesting answer there, Lauren. You don't know what the criteria is for Criterion. But look, as I said before, I do like Criterion. They've got some really terrible films because they make deals with directors. But I guess I just like Criterion because it's an ever-changing list. The other Criterion one, the Eclipse one, actually is static because they're not making any more Eclipse titles. So that one's a little bit annoying, but I guess I like the variety that they put out there. And yeah, I guess you've joined Tom there with Noir List. I can understand it. And I think you've also brought an interesting point there about the way that it's compiled. It's not necessarily the most scientific way to put it compared to the way that you and Chris Reynolds go through all the lists in They Shoot Zombies and weight differently. It's very different the way that Bill's put it together for the Noir List. Oh, okay. The list that you make and that Chris Reynolds helps you with a lot, but it's actually all Lauren. But anyway, moving on to the 2 I think are the worst, are the ones that for me add nothing more to the pool of films being printed on iCheck Movies. So my absolute worst list is Leonard Maltin's 100 must-see films of the 20th century. Every single film on that list is already on 6 other lists. Almost all the films are on 8 lists or more. Anybody who's basically working on any other list is going to get it platinum on the Leonard Maltin list without even trying. For me, it's just a really boring list from a critic who's was in his day, probably not today, but was in his day, considered quite big. He's got other lists. He's got hidden gems lists and other lists like that. But the one which is on I Check Movies is his top 100 of the 20th century, which has got no unique picks at all. It's got no films that are on less than 6 lists. It's a great list. Nobody would miss it if it was unadopted. I mean, yes, they might lose one platinum, but nobody would miss it. It doesn't serve any purpose at all being there. Lauren would miss her platinum, but she has to get used to the fact that sometimes it's nice not to have platinum. So the other list, which I've got there for my second worst, is one which was actually adopted very recently, and I think it's the worst list that's been adopted in the whole time that I've been on iCheck Movies, so since February 2017. And the list is ASC's 100 Milestone Films in Cinematography of the 20th Century. Again, looking in terms of unique picks, there are only 2 films out of the 100. So all the films on there have already been promoted elsewhere on the site. The list is so boring that Lauren hasn't even ever looked at the list since it's been adopted. But it's also boring as a cinematography list. I mean, I've gone through the titles there, and they're all the standard films you'd expect to see. They're on the best shot list. There's nothing strange or unusual there. A best cinematography list should be from around the world, from different countries. It should be some obscure things that maybe you haven't heard of. Not all the best films of all time are the best shot films of all time. Some films that have got really great cinematography are actually pretty crappy films, but they're worth it for the cinematographic experience. So for me, it's absolutely useless list. I almost posted something very unflattering towards the mods when they had said that they adopted it, but I just wrote something to the effect of, I've got nothing good to say, so I'm not going to say anything. But for me, that's the most disappointing list adoption that I've had in the whole time that I've been on iCheck Movies.
Thinking back at who might use ICM, I do think that having lists of the most usual suspects and having a few lists like that makes a lot of sense for new and inexperienced users that just wants to catch up on the biggest films of all time, the films that everyone talks about having the best visuals. That is valuable to some people, but yeah, this list really doesn't look like anything too special, and I'm not really sure why they chose this one.
Someone else needs to take over the hosting now because Saul has gone to lie down after that rant.
Hopefully none of the list mods are getting annoyed at me. Do you use sites other than iCheck Movies to find movie lists? And sorry, we'll start with Chris again.
Not so much anymore. I used to use IMDb a lot. I use Letterboxd to find lists, but just in terms of tracking films and seeing what I've seen, not seen, and get a really quick overview, I mainly use ICM just because I haven't imported my ratings to Letterboxd yet. It's just so much easier, so it's mainly ICM for me.
You probably wouldn't be alone in that camp, Chris. What about you, Tom?
I do rely heavily on iCheck Movies, but I also use Letterboxd for a few lists that I enjoy. One of the lists I follow is all the films to have ever played at Fright Fest. So whenever I'm short for time and I don't know what to watch, I'll just go on that list, see which one's available on my streaming service, and watch a quick horror film. So yeah, that's one I like. And another one that I've discovered on Letterboxd that I enjoy is disturbing, controversial, shocking, bizarre, and messed up, The Ultimate Guide. And that's 2,000 films. So that's been a good one lately for me to discover some quite obscure films that I might not have found through the existing lists on ICM. But other than that, it does tend to be ICM as my main source for film lists.
Wow, Tom. What about you, Wayne?
I use the ICM a lot, but I'm surprised it hasn't been mentioned yet. The forum itself, the ICM forum, the list we make every month, I use a lot of them to find films. They're a brilliant list of people with the correct interest, forming an opinion on what's the best of whatever topic, and they are great to use. Like, I don't use IMDb lists anymore because the ones I want are on ICM. Yeah, it's basically I check movies and the ICM forum with some coming from Letterboxd for me.
Thanks, Wayne, and yeah, good mention. What about you, Adam?
I mean, I pretty much only use ICM to work through lists, but I also work through personal lists on there. I might add some personal lists of my own. So, for example, I'm working through like the 2020s films and I'm using different sources, but I only use ICM to actually sort of track my progress. And most of the lists I want anyway, like Sight and Sound or whatever, most of them are on there as personal lists. So that's pretty much, yeah, I pretty much do everything on ICM.
Yeah, a lot of us do use ICM quite heavily.
I still use iCheck Movies mostly, but I also use Letterboxd as well now, just because I like using a combination of IMDb, iCheck Movies, and Letterboxd because the taste of all three communities are a little different. So it's just nice to get a bit of a mix. And also the forum lists I use as well. And also because I'm always looking for lists for They Shoot Zombies. So I'm also finding those, but that's kind of a different issue. But I also use them to like harvest films I haven't seen yet to chuck on my watch list, but no specific site.
Thanks, Lauren. I probably use Letterboxd more than I check movies for lists, just because there's more lists on Letterboxd, and I can also filter them by streaming services. So that's a really cool thing that I can do as a patron member on Letterboxd. So for me, it's better to use. The only thing that's better about iCheck Movies is you can actually see tons of lists for a film at once. If you go to Letterboxd, you can only see 10 lists at a time that a certain film is on. Whereas the iCheck Movies, you can see every single list it's on. So for me, that's a useful function. But in terms of finding things to watch, I probably use Letterboxd more than iCheck Movies for lists. So I did have one more question, which was about lists that would like to be made official. But before we get to that, does anybody have anything else they'd like to add to the conversation?
I think that iCheck Movies in particular, if we're talking about it, has become a little bit too messy with the 260 plus lists. So, I wish that they somehow did something to reorganize to make things easier. For instance, if they change things to be, introductory lists where you have this easy list that everyone can see and an advanced list, for instance, and then get some lists that are really out there. I don't see the point for official and unofficial lists anymore either, but I realize that would remove a part of the site's appeal. ICM should do something to just create a little bit more clarity in how the official lists are used and how lists are used on the site, because it's getting a bit too big.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. That's probably a fair point about it getting a bit big. The progress page is gigantic at the moment. I do wish there were a lot more official lists. We might get to later, but maybe there's some way of managing it. So maybe you need to click to toggle to get the whole list on there, and it only shows you maybe 20 rather than 236 at once. Because the progress page is a bit messy, but yeah, I do like having a lot of lists.
Yeah, no, if they ever removed the official, what you could do is recommended lists, and then you could do featured lists, perhaps monthly featured list or a list of recommended lists. New lists, and then there could be tabs, or you could just add in the list you're working on yourself based on your interests. Right now, they exist as plugins designed by forum members, so I'm really happy for that. So I've used them myself, but for most regular users, they don't have that, so they don't have the ability to track their progress and easily see their favorite lists unless they click on everything the favorite watch listed from the tabs on top. There's different ways ICM could sort things out and make it more digestible or make it more personalized. But I don't have a big issue with how the site runs in general.
I think I agree with Chris, but I think it's probably a resources issue, because I think what's a shame is Letterboxd came along and it's very slick and it probably has lots of money and lots of people behind it. So I feel like iCheck Movies has all the functionality, but with more resources or more people, they could probably modernize it a bit and make it more appealing. I think I think it works for us kind of hardcore users, but I don't think it would work so well for younger, newer users. But I think there's also like limitations on what the site owners and mods and everything can do. So I think a combination of ICM and Letterboxd would probably be the best. But I think it is what it is, and it's probably always going to be like this now, which is okay.
I'd just like to add that I'm quite happy with the site where it's at the moment, and I think it's worth giving a shout out to the list mods because, to be fair, I think they have quite a difficult task of trying to please all of our users. We've got some very vocal users with some strong opinions, and it must be hard, quite a balancing act to decide what remains official, what lists they introduce. So I do appreciate the work that they do.
So, speaking of the work that our list mods do, one of the biggest things that they do is new lists to add to the progress page to make them official. So, my final question for this podcast is, what other lists would you like to be made official? And I haven't set a limit on this, so I guess Adam could group quite a few of them together and do a lot, but let's say maybe keep it to 5 at the most. I think that would be fair. Chris, any list that you'd like to be made official on iCheck Movies, noting the fact that you actually don't care about official lists?
Yeah, this is the problem. I'm working on this list on iCheck Movies, no matter if they're official or not. I think the Yugoslav Film Archive's 100 Serbian Films, Cultural Heritage, is a very good one. I would love to get the Yugoslavian list in general, but I haven't really been able to find a particularly big or good enough one. But just like Serbia during the Yugoslav era was one of the strongest film nations. There's just so many great films coming out from that period. So it's just really odd that they haven't really been covered. I've also pushed for a Norwegian list before, just because you have the Amanda Award there, which just goes back a few decades, and it makes sense to get like the big 100 Norwegian films you should see, even though it's not the best list in the world. But it's just to represent my country. And I would say that, like Adam said, the top 1,000 from the forum, ICM Forum's 1,000 favorite films, that would be a very nice addition to, because that's another list I do work on a lot. And even expanding the 500, 400 list, that would be very good, like the full 1,000 I work on as well. So I don't think I'm going to throw up too many other lists, but those would be nice to get added and give some extra exposure to.
Oh, yes, that's an amazing shout out, Chris. I absolutely love the 1,000 list, to the point where I'm actually taking on compiling it every single year. The user who was doing that's no longer active on the forum, and also do a list of the 1,001 to 2,000 rated films. So yeah, I'd love to see an expanded version of the 500 under 400 list on there, as well as the forum top 1,000. I think, that's an obvious candidate for adoption, although the list mods might think otherwise. What about you, Tom?
So I really like the introduction of the recent ICM decades lists, and I'd like to see something similar based around countries. So I think the only way that would work would be to incorporate an existing project into officialdom, because with countries it's a lot more difficult to clarify what films belong to certain countries with international productions and such. It's not as easy as with the yearly list. Well, this film was released in that year. It's, simple, straightforward. So there's two things that could potentially work there. Lauren started compiling the highest rated films, and there's already some lists which provide a country breakdown. And then also Ferg has been working on a project over the past few years whereby we vote for the best films from a number of countries. So either of them somehow making it to officialdom could be a good thing for the site. Again, it's something that involves the users of the site more, and it would offer an interesting alternative perspective from a critic's view of the best films from a country to a cinephile's view of the best films of a certain country. So yeah, I think that's it. That would be a thing that I'd like to see on the site.
Yeah, that's an amazing idea. Rally Brett or Ferg, goes by both names, to sort of make those official, because it's a really interesting project what he's working on, And I think the fact that it's the views of quite a few forum members, so it's not just one or two people, I think would make them very valid as well as very interesting additions to the website. What about you, Wayne?
I'll start off with thirding that one about Ferg's country list. I'd love to see that official. We put in a lot of work every month for that, and Ferg, of course, puts in the most work. So, yeah, it'll be great just to, 20 best films from every country in one list. Can't go wrong with that. But as for the list that I'd like to see official, I've been putting forward a lot, especially for the another Australian list. The one we have at the moment is okay, but I don't think it covers us enough and that. So I was tasked with trying to find another list that would be better. Unfortunately, I only found one that was from the Adelaide Film Festival, was the top 100 films as well. But it was a bit more modern, it didn't have a lot of the older films, things like that. So my suggestion has been that a lot of the big countries have a best of list and their national award. So I try to champion to get the actor award as an official list. The best Australian movie since, I think it was about the 60s or 70s it started. I don't have the information in front of me. But just to have a second Australian list with a whole group of good films in it, have more representation to a country which, that's my home country. I've probably seen more Australian films than anyone here. Maybe, I don't know how many movies Sol's seen. He probably has seen more than me, but that's the first one. The other one that I've been putting forward when main site has their polls and that for new list is the GLAD Award, the best, most outstanding film for LGBT movies. They give out 2 awards, a mainstream and an indie one. So there's, 2 films get added every year. There's, especially in the forum, there's a lot of members of that community, and I believe they should be represented. It was mentioned earlier about the African list needing to be updated as an area that I'm exploring a lot more. Again, I'd love to see a better African list. And then the last one, just a personal one, Flickchart. I'd love to see their top 250 or something adopted. I know it's the same old movies, but it's the other main site I use, and I'd love to see that website given more power from another site, sort of thing.
Great answers there, Wayne. I don't watch a lot of crappy Australian dramas, so I don't know, but I definitely watch a lot of Australian genre films and comedies, so who knows? It could be an interesting head-to-head episode with you, or you try and work out who's seen the most Australian films, but we're getting a bit off topic. Going back on topic, Adam, what would you like to see added to ICM as an official list?
Yeah, first of all, I guess I wanted to agree with a lot of the points that have been made so far. I really like Tom's idea of the country lists. I like Wayne's idea of like an LGBT plus list. I think that they'd both be great. And I think my main thing, I'd really love there to be like an ICM tab on iCheck Movies that kind of replaces the IMDb one, so that you have the ICM decade list, then you have the ICM genre list, maybe something else if we could add it. But I think making the most of the community opinions and the favorites on the website, I think that would be a really great idea. Obviously, the ICM forum 1001 favorites, obviously I'd like to see that official. I'm kind of biased, but I feel like we deserve it considering some of the other official lists. The 500 less than 400 expanding to 1000, like I kind of agree with that, but I also think probably difficult to work through at the moment and might be even harder with 1000, but I wouldn't be against giving more attention to those films. And I guess finally, I kind of like what Wayne was saying about having like 2 lists for Australia, for example. doing that for other countries. So, like for me, I'd love to see another Japanese list. I think sometimes what happens on the website is they have one list which doesn't really work that great, and then everything kind of stops at that one list, and it misses out other important films or awards. So I don't think it should just be one list only per country. Yeah, and Saul is joking about, I don't know if he's joking, but Saul mentioned a Scottish list to me just now. And I mean, I would like a Scottish list. It's a bit, I don't know if there's that many great Scottish lists, and it's a bit harder. But it's a bit harder with Scottish lists because, like on IMDb, they're in the UK. But I would like a Scottish list, and to be honest, I'd like a list for most countries. I think it would take ICM being reorganized quite a bit. But I'd love the idea that you go into ICM, you could like filter by continent, you could go into like all these different areas. But I think that would require the distinction between official and unofficial being removed. But I'd love to go on and it's more like a database of lists. So, yeah, so you've got Europe, you've got Africa, you've got Asia, everywhere. And like, I think that could work really well as a way of exploring films, because I think we've got to the point that we've expanded to so many lists, but it's a bit messier now. But I also realise it would take a lot of work. But I think everyone's had a lot of great ideas, to be honest.
I just love your idea there, Adam. I think that if ICM went away from just being a game or a gamification to being just this library of lists, that would be very, very, very welcome. But yeah, let's see what happens in the future. I don't think it's going to change. I'm happy with the situation as it is, but like anything that gives us more interesting recommendations of films to dive into, it's very welcome.
Adam, you've got some really cool ideas for redesigning the site. I also do thoroughly agree. Also, yeah, adopting our own top 1,000 would be an absolute great addition to the website. What about you, Lauren?
I agree with what Adam suggested, especially with adding more I Check Movies based lists. Like, I'd really love I Check Movies genre lists. I'm not actually that interested in country lists. I just don't care about that stuff. But yeah, more community lists are fun, more like forum lists. And generally, like, yeah, I feel like there's a really big emphasis on country lists and awards. And I don't really care about either of those. So I don't have any specific lists in mind, but more like fun lists, like mentioned before, like the Tim Dirks list and just like things like that, things that cover areas of film that aren't really covered by the other things, and genres and topics that are lacking. And yeah, I think more like LGBT lists, if they're good, I guess. I remember there was a problem like finding good quality lists. So yeah, just covering those little areas, but I don't have any specific lists because I'm too lazy.
I also think I like an I Check Movies tab with the genres and decades. In an ideal world, we'd have an ICM forum tab as well with some of our lists, but I realise that's not going to happen. But in my vision of it being more of a database, it's something that could happen. But again, I don't think it's very workable. So yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. In terms of the lists that I would like to get added, I guess I don't really have much to add beyond what you guys have already added. I would like to see another They Shoot Zombies list, just because there's so much extensive stuff that's done with weighting the films. They Shoot Zombies Hidden Horrors list, which is sort of like a hidden gems list for horror. I would love to see that adopted. I also wouldn't mind having the 1001 to 200 part of the They Shoot Zombies list adopted, because we've done that for They Shoot Pictures, and I know that's a bit different, but horror is the biggest niche genre out there, so I think having another 1,000 films would be great, or having a hidden gems horror list would be great. And the other one, and I know some people are going to like this, but in terms of being progressive and seeing where most film goers are going these days, I think it's a big hole that there's no letterboxd list. It doesn't even have to be the letterboxd top 250 if a list mods didn't want to adopt that, but they've also got women-directed top 250 lists, and they've even got a letterboxd horror lists. There's a whole bunch of letterboxd lists out there, and I think by not having them on the website, I think it's going to be hard to attract new users, because looking at the vote counts, people these days, young people, they're on IMDb. So all these IMDb lists are basically pointless. They're on Letterboxd. So I think having a Letterboxd list in there would be a good thing.
Yeah, and I'll fully agree with that. I mean, I think it's ridiculous that Letterboxd Top 250 isn't there, because Letterboxd has grown to be a much more popular and important site than IMDb in so many ways, especially with our side of the niche of people interested in cinema. So it should be there. When the IMDb Top 250 is there, when random forum lists are there, Letterboxd Top 250 should be there, even if it doesn't bring any new films in. And other Letterboxd lists I wouldn't have an issue with either.
And with that, I think we have reached the end of the episode. If there's any feedback you'd like to give us, whether it be what the hell is I Check Movies, or if you disagree or agree with any of our suggestions for list adoptions or the best or worst of the lists, please drop us a line at icmforum.com. There will be a thread dedicated to this topic. Please search for us and give us your feedback, any feedback, even if it's what on earth did you mean when you said check whoring, we'll respond to it. Thank you so much for listening, and join us again soon.
You have been listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.